So I'm kind of getting over a cold, so if I sound semi-congested, that's why. 2023 was a really terrible year in terms of my personal life, but also kind of in my reading. I really didn't read as much as I have in previous years or as much as I wanted to. But I'm trying not to be too hard on myself for that because I definitely did still read quite a bit. And the things that I read were pretty good. Not everything, though, was pretty good. I have a list of 10 books with me. 6 books are my best books of the year, and then 4 are my worst books of the year. There weren't really enough of like best or worst books to justify doing an individual video for both, so I decided to just combine them into one and make it easier. Most of these books I have physically. Some of them are audiobooks. For the worst books, I've ordered this pretty like definitely like the worst to least worst or whatever. But the best books, it's kind of arbitrary. It could change on any given day. But let's go ahead and start with the worst book. So number 4, I have The Only One Left by Rayleigh Sager. This was kind of like a Lizzie Borden-esque story about a girl who like axe murders her entire family. Oop, or did she? And a woman who has to go and be her caretaker. This was not the worst Riley Sager I've read. That will come later. But it wasn't great either. The story itself was pretty fine and entertaining. I definitely kept like listening to it. I was definitely like intrigued. My biggest problem came from the ending. Of course, with like mystery thrillers, the main character that we follow is never directly unrelated to the situation. It's always seemingly like, why me out of everybody? But there ends up being a reason why or how they're connected to the story. I didn't like how their protagonist was connected to this story. I didn't really get anything out of that. And I felt like the ending was very like neat and tidy. I don't know, I wanted a little more mess out of it. I didn't like that everything was like, oh, and it was all okay in the end. I'm not really like a fan of that, but those are really the only complaints I had about it. Other than that, I guess it was okay. Um, oh, actually, not only that, the audiobook narrator was like grating. Like the voice was terrible. Not really a big fan, but that wasn't necessarily the book's fault, so I'll give it a pass on that. Number 3 is another audiobook, and that is The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell. This one is about a big like grand house, and all these people start moving into it, and there's like a death, like a mass suicide or whatever that happens, and you're supposed to be figuring out what happened to these kids that were living in the house. Again, it was fine. It was like okay, it was entertaining to read. My biggest problem with it though was like a lot of the twists and stuff were really like expected, and I'm not really one that needs a thriller to be like so unpredictable and I had no idea what was going on. I like being right. You know, I don't mind a little bit of predictability in a thriller. I feel like that's the author doing its job well, sowing in kind of seeds of like what is gonna happen at the end. I think like yeah, and gives the reader an opportunity to kind of solve things for themselves. I like that. I like being able to figure things out, and I like being right. But this one was just like way too easy. A lot of stuff was like framed as a twist where I was like, oh, were we not supposed to know that like the entire time? Next book I actually do have physically, and that is E. Lockhart's Genuine Fraud. This is about a girl who just has like a secret or whatever that we're supposed to figure out. She's like lying about her identity. And it's told like out of order, which I think is the only thing that made the story mildly interesting, was that the chapters were kind of like all out of order, and I think that could have been cool except for the fact that like once you figured out what was going on, it stopped being interesting. It got to a point where I kind of wondered why I was still reading, and the answer is to finish the fucking book. But it just didn't feel like satisfactory. Really, if you want a book or if you want something with this premise, I think there's that movie, Is it called The Fantastic Mr. Ripley, or am I making that up? But it's basically like the same story, so I would much rather watch the movie than read this book. And my worst book of the year goes to The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. This at a point is like a me problem. I need to stop picking up Riley Sager books. I never like them. But unfortunately, I don't think I've learned my lesson. But The House Across the Lake is about a woman who lives in this kind of like small community built around a lake, and she witnesses something across in the house across the lake that she's pretty suspicious about. She starts to investigate and try to dig and find out what happened to one of her neighbors. She definitely suspects, the husband, as you usually do in a thriller. And of course, it turns out things are not as simple and cut and dry as she might have imagined. This, I think, is like a polar opposite of what I was talking about with The Family Upstairs, where it's like the twist or whatever that came out of this was so beyond out of left field that instead of being like surprised by it, I actually just got very angry. It started playing at a sort of like supernatural element that was going on that just felt like it really didn't match the tone of like the rest of the story of what we were supposed to be reading. And so by like the last third, it felt like the ending of a completely different book that I didn't realize that I was reading. And it left me feeling very frustrated and angry. And I was certainly not a fan. Now that we've gotten all the negatives out of the way, and there weren't really a lot, so I guess overall it was a pretty okay reading year in terms of quality. So let's go ahead and start talking about the best books. Next, I want to talk about Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I'm first of all really grateful to this book to being like one of the first books of the year that like I was able to kind of break out of my reading slump. By the end of like 2022, I was definitely slowing down in my reading and really like not feeling the same passion that I used to. And reading this kind of started to reignite things for me. So kudos to Piranesi for that. But this is about a person named Piranesi who lives in a labyrinth. His only other companion is a man who visits him every so often and kind of helps him in his work with studying this labyrinth. And it was really great. I really enjoyed the writing. I enjoyed the perspective of Piranesi. I will say, all throughout the book, I thought Piranesi was like this. Like, I thought this was Piranesi. Like, I thought he was like a Laura Lake Satyr like creature and everything. And I was like, oh, this is really cute. This is like very magical and fun. And then, spoilers, I guess. But like reaching the end of the book and finding out he was just like a dude was definitely a shock to me. But I really loved the writing, and I loved reading from Piranesi's perspective. I thought he was just like a sweet and fun character to read from. And Susanna Clarke has a very like fairy tale-esque writing style in this that just made it a lot of fun to read, and I really enjoyed it. Next on my list is The Writing Retreat, and the author's name, unfortunately, is escaping me. But this book is about a woman who goes on a writing retreat hosted by this elusive author who publishes like once every so often and just like all these like breakout and like fantastic books and all that. And it's her and a few other women, and obviously some spooky things start to happen, and she is starting to question what exactly the intentions of the host of the retreat and what exactly is going on. This was like definitely like a trip to listen to. Excuse me. Jesus. Did you see that? This was definitely a trip to listen to. I thought it was so much fun. I really like things that are like really wild and kind of like out of left field and all that, and that's definitely what this was. It definitely, see, this I think did sort of what House Across the Lake was trying to do a lot better, where it starts to tie in all these like really freaky, almost borderline supernatural elements into a sort of maybe otherwise grounded story. But I feel like this was much more successful in the way that those elements played out and added to the story instead of trying to like carry it. But yeah, it was definitely a lot of fun, and I think maybe one I would like to even try to read physically. When I listen to audiobooks, it's not necessarily that I don't notice the quality of writing. I think I just can appreciate it a lot more reading text rather than like just listening to it. But even just listening to the writing retreat, I could tell that it was really nicely written. And so it's definitely one that I would like to be able to read physically. So I might have to pick up a copy. And next, kind of in theme with fairy tale-esque writing, is a children's Bible by Lydia Miller. I think I heard about this from Sage's channel. Sage Reads, I think, is still their channel name. And it's about this group of kids that are all stuck together because their parents are old friends and are on this big grand summer vacation. I thought that this was really interesting in the way that the children like kind of like acted like amongst each other. They had this sort of game going on where they didn't want each other to know who was their parents. I thought that was a lot of fun. There was a lot of like Christian imagery that started to like be used in this, which I thought like again made it a lot of fun. And the writing style was again like something that was just like really beautiful and like sucked me in. I read like half of this book in like one sitting. And I never do that. I even with books I like, sometimes I can only read like 10 pages at a time. So it goes to show just how great this book was, honestly. I thought it was really interesting how we definitely got specific characters and all that. There was definitely specific named characters and you could tell who the narrator was, but a lot of it was sort of told as like a joint perspective, and I thought that was like a super interesting way to write this, how all these kids kind of like became a sort of collective and all of that. And yeah, I just thought it was a really, really beautifully written and interesting book. Next, I have Pearl by Josh Malerman. This is about a pig that is able to basically mind control people and like make them carry out its bidding and all of that. And this was just such a fantastic and fun time. I think if you're a fan of Stephen King and Stephen King's like especially kind of like early work, then this will be up your alley. The writing style was really reminiscent of Stephen King. And the story itself was just like a lot of fun. I think the concept is kind of hard to do a bad job with. Like a killer pig is kind of intriguing enough on its own. But just the way that the story was told was also very interesting. The perspectives that we got from the pig was like super cool. And what I love about this book, and I love, don't get me wrong, I do love like a slow build horror novel, but also sometimes I'm like, let's just get to the point. Like, let's just go ahead and get started. So, like, I think, like, chapter 1, this pig already has, like, a body count, and it's, like, fantastic. This is exactly what I'm here for. This was just a, like, really great and, not necessarily spooky. Like, I'm not afraid of pigs after reading this, but it was very, like, chilling and thrilling. And the ending was very, like, haunting. Actually, I thought the ending was really fantastically done. A lot of, I think, horror novels, Stephen King, can kind of struggle with their endings and sort of like living up to what was just built. But I think this ended in such a great way where it's like there could be this neat, happy ending, or maybe there's something else going on. I don't want to say any more because I think you should read this book. If you haven't already, I feel like this is one I'm kind of late to, but it was great. I've been recommending this actually to a lot of friends, so definitely a fun time. Next, I have Notes on Execution by Danya Kafka. This is about a man who is on death row for killing several women, and it was super interesting because we got his perspective for sure. It was a lot of his musings and stuff while he's waiting for his execution, but a lot of the crux of the story, a lot of the main kind of like meat of the story is told from the perspective of women that were like involved in his life in some way. So, you know, you get his mother, the sister of one of his victims, and all that. It was definitely really interesting, and I think did a great job of both showing sort of like the humanity in this man and showing that, you know, not every people aren't born evil. It's circumstances that lead us to the actions that we commit, but also not forgiving him for his actions just because he had a rough upbringing and just because he had some sort of like justification for his behavior in his mind. And also we were able to feel sympathy for how the system really failed him. There was never like a sort of like question of like, oh, well, maybe he's misunderstood. It's like, no, he still did these very terrible things. It's just, it gives a sort of like human perspective of this man. But yeah, reading this, I'm all in favor of rehabilitation over prison, a prison abolitionist. So reading it from that perspective, I just thought I got a lot out of this. And the last book I have to talk about is Something That May Shock and Discredit You by Daniel Mallory Ortberg. This is a memoir from Daniel, who is a trans man that was raised evangelical, and his kind of reckoning with that, and just a lot of his other musings and all that. What I thought was very interesting about this was not just Daniel talking about his gender identity and reconciling that with his religion. Shiny as fuck book. It's a library copy. But a lot of his sort of like essays on like various like media, like he talks a lot about Golden Girls, Columbo, and all of that, and ties it in a way where he's still talking about himself and still talking about his story. And I really love that. I think you can tell a lot about a person by not necessarily the media they consume, but by what they're getting out of it. And so I just thought that this was like a really like great book. I also enjoyed reading from the perspective of someone who transitioned like fairly later in life. I transitioned pretty early. I kind of always suspected that there was something going on with me gender wise, but I kind of kept pushing it off and being like, I'm not gonna think about all that right now. But still, in the grand like scheme of things, I came out like very early. Like I was openly trans in high school, and all through college. And I've been like living as a man for essentially like my entire adult life. So it was really interesting reading from the perspective of someone who later in life started to like really think about these things. It's also really nice to see how many even though we had sort of like different experiences in terms of coming out and all of that, it was interesting to see the things that we have in common. Like I said, I kind of suspected I was trans pretty early on, but decided like I'm not really gonna think about that right now. And Daniel definitely went through the same thing, which I thought was very interesting. I'm going to actually read a quote from here that I really hold close to my heart, and I think a lot of other like trans people enjoy this quote, and you might have heard it before, but you might not have known where it's from. So I'm telling you right now, it's from Something That May Shock and Discredit You. But the quote is, God blessed me by making me transsexual for the same reason God made wheat but not bread, and fruit but not wine, so that humanity might share in the act of creation. And I really love that quote so much. Whenever I first heard it, it did really help me start to stop looking at my transition as an inconvenience and start looking at it as something that I get to experience. And yeah, it's overall a really great book. If you're trans, then I think it's a great read, but also if you are cisgender and looking to get a little more insight of the trans experience, I definitely think that this is a fantastic perspective to read from. So yeah, pretty short list in total. Probably gonna be a short video. Like I said, did not do a lot of reading. And my memory is a little foggy. Some of these I have not read in quite a long time, but I hope you enjoyed. Hopefully I will be back to uploading more frequently. I did kind of miss doing this little channel. And I certainly missed reading. I've definitely felt my love for reading reignited within the past last month and also all through like the start of this year. So hopefully you'll be able to see lots more from me. And yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know some of your favorite or least favorite books that you read last year. Like and subscribe if you feel so inclined, and that's going to be it for me.